History often tells us that sexual abuse was a crime only men could commit and only women could suffer from, but what if that story is not the whole truth? For centuries, scholars assumed that women lacked the power or intent to harm men sexually, and that men were somehow invulnerable to such abuse. This belief shaped the way we understand the past, leaving critical stories untold, especially the experiences of enslaved black men in the American South. These men endured a hidden form of suffering, one rarely discussed in textbooks or mainstream media. White women, often wielding wealth, social status, and ownership over enslaved people, could exert control in ways that were both subtle and devastating. From coerced labor to sexual exploitation, the lives of these men were profoundly shaped by a system designed to deny them autonomy and dignity. Their voices, while historically silenced, reveal the complex intersection of race, gender, and power in ways that challenge our assumptions about slavery and oppression. In this video, we explore these overlooked stories, shining a light on the hidden realities that traditional narratives often ignore. Through historical accounts, autobiographies, and legal records, we uncover how enslaved black men navigated a world where even the most trusted individuals could become oppressors. These stories remind us that history is multidimensional, and the truths of those who suffered are essential to understanding the past fully. If you want to uncover more hidden histories and learn stories that have been ignored for too long, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated. Let us dive into this untold chapter of history and give voice to those who were silenced. In the complex and cruel world of slavery, light-skinned enslaved individuals occupied a peculiar and precarious position, often caught between their own communities and the gaze of the white elite who controlled every aspect of their lives. These men and women, products of mixed-race unions or generations of forced proximity, were seen through a lens shaped not only by racial hierarchy but also by a deep social fascination with color and appearance. Their lighter skin, which might have offered some superficial privileges in other contexts, instead made them particularly visible and, tragically, more vulnerable to exploitation in a system that commodified both their labor and their bodies. For light-skinned male slaves, this visibility often translated into unwanted attention and coercion from white women who wielded power in ways that extended far beyond the domestic sphere. Historical accounts reveal that these men were singled out not simply because of proximity or convenience, but because their appearance elicited fascination and desire, providing a socially sanctioned outlet for expressions of control and dominance that were entwined with the rigid structures of slavery. In some plantations, light-skinned men were forced to perform tasks that went far beyond ordinary labor, attending to the personal whims of their owners in ways that could blur the boundaries between servitude and abuse. Diaries, legal petitions, and personal narratives suggest that their very presence became a focal point for dynamics of power, manipulation, and sexual coercion, with consequences that left lasting scars both physically and psychologically. Women who held authority over these men, whether as mistresses of the house or young girls trained from infancy in the management of enslaved people, sometimes exercised that authority through subtle or overt acts of domination. Social norms of the time complicated the visibility of such abuses. The idea of women as inherently incapable of sexual aggression created a veil of silence around these interactions, ensuring that many of the abuses went unrecorded or were dismissed as rumor. Yet, surviving narratives provide glimpses into the emotional and physical strain endured by light-skinned male slaves, whose lives were constantly negotiated against a backdrop of desire, control, and the inescapable reality of their status as property. The vulnerability of light-skinned enslaved individuals also highlights the paradox of beauty and oppression in the plantation context. Whereas their lighter appearance might have elicited admiration or fascination, it simultaneously subjected them to a more intense and often more personal form of scrutiny and domination. as the very traits that marked them as exceptional within the slave community rendered them targets of exploitation. In some cases, this included coerced relationships orchestrated by white women who sought both the thrill of control and the reinforcement of social hierarchies, demonstrating how personal desire was inseparable from the larger structures of racial and economic power. By understanding the particular vulnerabilities of light-skinned slaves, we begin to see the complex layers of slavery not as a uniform system, but as one in which power, race, and gender intersected in ways that shaped individual experiences profoundly. The stories of these men and women reveal a nuanced reality in which the boundaries between attraction, coercion, and exploitation were manipulated by those who held power, offering a haunting reminder that even perceived privilege within oppression could bring with it unique and devastating risks. Their experiences underscore the ways in which slavery operated not only as a system of labor, but also as a framework for controlling bodies, desires, and identities, leaving a legacy that historians are only now beginning to fully trace and understand. History often remembers slavery through the lens of broad systems and statistics. Yet the most haunting truths emerge from the intimate accounts preserved in diaries, autobiographies, and legal records, where the lived experiences of those who endured oppression come into focus with striking clarity. Among these accounts, the narratives of enslaved black men who suffered at the hands of white women reveal a dimension of cruelty that has long been obscured, overshadowed by assumptions about gender, power, and propriety. Autobiographies like Harriet Jacobs provide windows into the daily reality of a world where authority was absolute and resistance perilous, where personal freedom was denied not only through labor but through control of the body itself, and where even the smallest gestures of autonomy could provoke punishment or retaliation. Jacobs' recollections of men forced into servitude in intimate and demeaning ways illustrate the complexity of sexual coercion under slavery. She tells of slaves like Luke, whose presence at the bedside of their master was mandated not simply to attend to physical needs, but to serve the more invasive demands of sexual exploitation. Their vulnerability amplified by the structures of household hierarchy and the absence of protective recourse. The subtleties of these abuses, veiled in the language of 19th-century propriety, underscore the deliberate attempts to obscure the lived realities of enslaved men, making the documentation of such events all the more vital for understanding the human toll of slavery. Diaries kept by travelers and observers of the era, like Peter Nielsen, corroborate instances in which white women exercised both social and sexual power over enslaved men, sometimes pursuing them with a calculated persistence that reflected both desire and an assertion of dominance, often while disregarding the emotional or physical consequences for their victims. Legal records, such as divorce petitions and depositions collected by commissions investigating the conditions of freed and enslaved people, provide another layer of evidence, revealing that sexual coercion was not merely anecdotal but systemic, occurring with sufficient regularity to be recognized in official proceedings. In some cases, these records describe white women pursuing enslaved men with an intensity that disrupted households and community dynamics, exposing both the intricate social webs of the plantation and the unique vulnerabilities of those held in bondage. The combination of these sources allows historians to piece together patterns of abuse that are otherwise invisible in mainstream historical narratives, offering a more complete and unsettling portrait of life under slavery. What emerges from these combined accounts is not only a story of individual suffering but also a broader commentary on the intersections of race, gender, and power. The men documented in these narratives were not abstract statistics. They were human beings whose lives were constrained by economic, social, and sexual coercion, whose bodies were subjected to exploitation in ways that reinforced the authority and desires of white women within the plantation hierarchy. By examining diaries, autobiographies, and legal records together, we gain insight into how personal accounts illuminate systemic oppression, revealing the mechanisms of control that extended beyond labor into the realm of the intimate and the psychological. These narratives, preserved despite attempts to erase or sanitize them, challenge conventional perceptions of slavery, forcing us to confront the reality that abuse and exploitation were not limited by gender, and that the exercise of power in the antebellum South took many forms, all of which left enduring marks on the lives of those who endured them, shaping histories that are only now beginning to be fully acknowledged and understood. On the plantations of the American South, power was exercised not only through law, labor, and land ownership but also through subtler and more intimate means, where the control of bodies became a language of dominance. Among the lesser explored dimensions of this hierarchy was the role of white women, whose authority over enslaved black men extended into realms of coercion that intertwined desire, social expectation, and economic control. Historical accounts reveal that sexual interactions orchestrated by these women were rarely simply about attraction or impulse. They were strategic, leveraging the vulnerability of enslaved men to assert influence both over them and, indirectly, over white men in their households or communities. In many, the exercise of sexual power became an extension of the existing racial and gendered hierarchies, demonstrating that dominance could manifest in personal and psychological arenas as much as in public or economic ones. Consider the documented cases where white women pursued relationships with enslaved men despite marital ties or societal expectations, often provoking tension or conflict within their households. These actions were not isolated incidents of desire, but part of a broader pattern in which white women asserted authority, shaping interactions to reinforce their social and sexual control. The consequences for the men involved were profound, as compliance was rarely voluntary, and resistance could lead to severe punishment. Social isolation, or physical violence. At the same time, the very act of engaging in such coercion served to manipulate social structures, subtly challenging male authority and asserting female power within the constraints of a patriarchal system that otherwise limited their agency. Diaries, legal petitions, and autobiographical accounts converge to show that this form of dominance was both calculated and culturally supported, often shielded by the prevailing belief that women were incapable of serious sexual harm. The psychological dimension of this dynamic was as significant as the physical, shaping the identities and lived experiences of enslaved men in ways that transcended individual incidents. Enslaved individuals recount the tension of navigating spaces where white women could command attention, affection, or service in ways that could dictate daily life. Labor responsibilities and social standing. The complex interplay of fear, attraction, obligation, and resistance created an environment in which power was constantly negotiated, and where the consequences of disobedience extended far beyond the immediate encounter. Historical scholarship illustrates that these interactions were not anomalies, but rather an extension of a system in which every facet of life could be harnessed to reinforce social hierarchies and maintain control over those considered property. By framing sexual abuse as a tool of dominance, white women were able to exercise influence that reverberated through the plantation structure, affecting both black and white men in the community. The authority wielded in these intimate spaces was an assertion of racial supremacy intertwined with the limited but significant power women could claim in a society structured to confine them. This dual impact, simultaneously subjugating black men while negotiating power over white men, highlights the intricate and often hidden strategies through which gender and race intersected to sustain oppression. In acknowledging this history, we gain a deeper understanding of the complex social choreography that defined the antebellum South, recognizing that the exercise of dominance was not singularly masculine nor uniformly public, but rather a multifaceted practice in which power, control, and coercion were inextricably linked to both identity and desire. leaving enduring imprints on the lives of those who were forced to navigate it. In the antebellum South, the image of the genteel white woman often obscures the reality of her active and decisive role within the institution of slavery, a role that extended far beyond the domestic sphere and into the economic, social, and even psychological dimensions of power. Historical research reveals that nearly 40% of slave owners were women, and their engagement with the system of slavery was deliberate, strategic, and intimately tied to their social standing and prospects. These women were not passive inheritors of property or silent companions to male authority. They bought, sold, and managed enslaved people with a degree of agency that was cultivated from childhood, taught through generations of socialization, and reinforced by a society that measured status and respectability through wealth and ownership. The ownership of enslaved people was more than an economic asset, it was a symbol of autonomy, a marker of influence, and a tool through which white women could negotiate their place within both family structures and the broader social hierarchy. From the earliest years, girls in slaveholding households were introduced to the mechanisms of control and management, observing and participating in the buying and selling of enslaved individuals, learning to supervise labor, and even practicing discipline under the watchful eyes of their mothers and elders. This early education in power extended to the enforcement of social norms, the orchestration of labor, and the maintenance of authority within the household, laying the foundation for a lifetime of engagement with an institution that thrived on the subjugation of others. Owning enslaved people allowed white women to exert influence independently of male relatives, and in some cases, they went to court to ensure that their legal rights to property were protected, sometimes even contesting the claims of husbands or male kin in order to preserve control over those they owned. The social implications of female ownership were equally profound. A woman with a substantial number of enslaved people was often seen as a more desirable marriage prospect, not only for the economic security she represented but also for the status she embodied. Her ability to manage and direct the lives of others reinforced her authority and shaped perceptions of competence, sophistication, and dominance within her social circle. This intertwining of economic power and social identity meant that the act of owning and controlling enslaved people was inseparable from notions of personal freedom and agency, and that the lives of those enslaved were continually subordinated to the ambitions and strategies of their female owners. Moreover, white women's involvement in slavery was not limited to passive oversight or abstract ownership. They actively participated in the daily enforcement of labor, discipline, and social order, often supervising work, punishing perceived disobedience, and orchestrating the complex logistics of plantations with the same intensity and precision as men. Their engagement extended to the strategic management of reproduction, coercion, and surveillance, ensuring that the enslaved population remained productive, controlled, and responsive to the expectations imposed upon them. By wielding authority in both domestic and public spheres, these women shaped the social fabric of the South, demonstrating that power in the antebellum world was not solely masculine, and that female agency, while circumscribed by gender norms, could manifest in ways that were both overt and insidiously effective. Understanding the role of white women as active participants in slavery reframes the narrative of oppression, revealing how social status, economic interest, and personal authority converged to maintain a system that relied on the subjugation of human beings. Their ownership and management of enslaved people, far from being incidental, was a central pillar of their identity and influence, a demonstration of how gender and race intersected to create complex hierarchies of power, control, and domination that shaped every aspect of life on the plantation and left an enduring mark on history. On the sprawling plantations of the American South, the machinery of slavery was not only maintained by men but carefully cultivated in women from the earliest stages of life. embedding systems of control and domination that would perpetuate itself across generations. Young girls born into slaveholding families were often given enslaved children as companions or gifts. But these relationships were far from innocent. They served as the first lessons in power, discipline, and hierarchy. From infancy or early childhood, these girls observed and participated in acts that conditioned them to see authority over human lives as natural, necessary, and even virtuous. Play and supervision were intertwined, creating a space in which the exertion of control became a form of education, and the capacity for enforcing obedience was treated as a skill to be refined over years. Accounts from interviews with formerly enslaved people, particularly those collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, reveal how this early socialization shaped behavior and expectations. Even small children were encouraged or required to participate in punishing enslaved individuals, and the lessons were both physical and psychological. Beatings and threats were normalized, often framed as routine discipline, teaching young girls to internalize the idea that authority was a right granted by birth and status, rather than a moral responsibility. The ability to manage, command, and enforce rules over others became a point of pride and a marker of maturity, preparing these girls to enter adulthood fully equipped to navigate, maintain, and expand the structures of slavery. As these girls grew into adolescence and adulthood, the skills and behaviors instilled in them became tools for maintaining both household order and social prestige. They oversaw labor, directed work schedules, and ensured compliance with the myriad rules that structured plantation life, exercising authority in ways that were often just as rigorous and consequential as that wielded by men. This training extended into the management of reproductive labor, the organization of domestic spaces, and even the orchestration of coerced interactions between enslaved individuals, all of which reinforced their social and economic status while perpetuating the subjugation of black people. Through this process, the ideology of white superiority was reinforced not just externally but internally, shaping attitudes, expectations, and behaviors that became second nature. The early cultivation of authority in white girls illustrates the insidious ways in which systemic oppression was normalized and perpetuated, embedding hierarchies of power within the very psychology of those raised to enforce them. By the time these girls reached adulthood, they were fully capable of navigating the social, economic, and sexual dimensions of slavery with confidence and authority, often exercising control over enslaved men and women in ways that mirrored the coercive strategies used by male plantation owners. The lessons learned in childhood discipline, supervision, management, and enforcement became the foundation for a lifetime of participation in and reinforcement of a brutal system, demonstrating that the structures of slavery were maintained not only through laws and economics, but also through careful socialization and psychological conditioning. By tracing the arc from childhood training to adult authority, it becomes clear that white women's participation in slavery was not incidental or passive, but cultivated, deliberate, and deeply entwined with identity and status. The cultivation of power in young girls ensured that systemic oppression would continue seamlessly, shaping generations of women to uphold, exploit, and sustain the institution of slavery while reinforcing the racial and social hierarchies that defined the antebellum South. This history underscores the profound ways in which childhood experiences, social expectations, and inherited authority intersected to maintain a system in which the lives of enslaved people were controlled, commodified, and systematically oppressed. Within the plantation households of the American South, the exercise of power extended beyond supervision of labor or management of domestic routines into the most intimate aspects of life, where white women often orchestrated sexual interactions among enslaved individuals as a means of controlling reproduction and preserving the labor force that underpinned their wealth and status. These acts were rarely impulsive. They were calculated strategies, deeply entwined with economic interests and the social hierarchies that defined Southern society. By directing who could pair with whom, when pregnancies would occur, and how the resulting children were raised, white women asserted authority not only over bodies but over the very continuity of their labor system, ensuring that the plantation's workforce remained productive, controllable, and within their immediate oversight. The manipulation of reproductive labor was thus both a method of economic preservation and a demonstration of dominance, reflecting the intersections of race, gender, and power in ways that are as disturbing as they are revealing. Historical accounts suggest that enslaved men and women often had little choice in these arrangements, navigating a landscape where coercion, threat, and the implicit promise of survival dictated personal decisions. Diaries, autobiographies, and legal testimonies reveal the ways in which white women sometimes sanctioned sexual violence between enslaved individuals, orchestrating acts that ensured the continuation of the workforce while maintaining the social order on which they relied. Formerly enslaved people reported that such interventions were common, demonstrating that control over reproduction was not a peripheral concern but a central aspect of maintaining power. In some cases, white women timed their own pregnancies or those of their domestic children to coincide with those of enslaved women, further entangling the lives of the enslaved with the strategic interests of their owners. These patterns illustrate the degree to which the personal, economic, and social spheres were inseparably linked, and how the lives of enslaved men and women were subjected to manipulation for the benefit of those in positions of authority. The orchestration of sexual labor also had profound psychological and social consequences. Enslaved men and women were forced to navigate relationships imposed upon them, often under the watchful eyes of overseers or the white women themselves, creating tensions, resentment, and fear while simultaneously reinforcing the hierarchical structure of plantation life. White women's capacity to manipulate reproductive outcomes was both a symbol and a tool of their authority, demonstrating that their social and economic power was inseparable from their ability to control the intimate and bodily lives of those enslaved. This power was not simply coercive in the moment. It had generational consequences, ensuring that the labor force remained within the control of the household and that lineage, identity, and labor were all subjected to the design of those with privilege. By examining these historical realities, it becomes evident that white women's management of reproductive labor was a calculated exercise of control, one that intertwined economic necessity with social dominance and personal authority. Their influence over sexual dynamics, pregnancy, and child rearing among enslaved people underscores the pervasive reach of power in the antebellum South, revealing how every facet of life, emotional, physical, and generational, was structured to benefit those at the top of the social hierarchy. These actions illuminate the intersections of desire, coercion, and authority, reminding us that the legacies of slavery were not only material but profoundly personal, shaping lives and communities in ways that are still being traced and understood today. The manipulation of reproduction, orchestrated by white women, stands as a stark testament to the calculated and pervasive nature of power within slavery, illustrating how deeply control could penetrate into the most intimate realms of human experience. In the annals of slavery, the voices of the oppressed were often muted, and the stories of those who dared to speak carried risks that could imperil both themselves and their families. Enslaved men who experienced sexual abuse at the hands of white women were particularly constrained, as their testimonies threatened not only their personal safety, but the carefully constructed image of white womanhood that Southern society sought to uphold, in a culture that idealized the purity, virtue, and delicacy of white women. Exposing abuse committed by women could provoke outrage, disbelief, or outright retaliation, rendering these narratives dangerous to share. As a result, many accounts were never published, ignored, or actively suppressed, leaving historians to piece together the truths of these experiences from fragmented records. Autobiographies and legal documents. Despite these barriers, some enslaved men documented their suffering, often employing coded language, veiled references, or indirect storytelling to convey the horrors they endured without directly naming the perpetrators. Autobiographies and interviews collected decades later reveal glimpses of coerced relationships, manipulations, and sexual assaults, offering critical insight into a dimension of slavery that was intentionally obscured. The need for discretion in these accounts speaks volumes about the social pressures of the time. To expose abuse by a white woman was to risk disbelief. Social ostracism, or violent retribution. Yet the persistence of these narratives, however subtle or incomplete, underscores the resilience and courage of those who bore witness to their own oppression. The suppression of these accounts also reflects a broader historical tendency to sanitize the narratives of slavery, focusing attention on white male perpetrators while minimizing or ignoring the agency and complicity of women. Slave narratives that directly implicated white women were often deemed too controversial, too damaging to social norms, or too politically inconvenient, resulting in a historical record that was both incomplete and biased. The erasure of these voices created a distorted understanding of power dynamics within the plantation system, obscuring the ways in which gender and race intersected to shape the experiences of enslaved men. Yet even within these silences, traces remain: testimonies collected by commissions, diaries, and legal petitions that document coerced labor, sexual manipulation, and the psychological toll of living under constant threat of exploitation. By examining these suppressed narratives, historians can begin to reconstruct the lived realities of enslaved men who navigated a world where speaking out could endanger their lives, yet remaining silent perpetuated the invisibility of their suffering. The accounts that survive reveal not only the abuses themselves, but the complex strategies of survival, resistance, and resilience employed by those targeted. They highlight how enslaved men had to negotiate a landscape in which social hierarchies and gender expectations constrained the expression of truth, shaping both personal experience and collective memory. Ultimately, the suppression of these narratives underscores the deliberate control over historical memory, illustrating how societal notions of femininity, virtue, and propriety were weaponized to conceal abuse and maintain the power structures of slavery. By acknowledging and analyzing these hidden stories, we gain a more nuanced understanding of oppression, recognizing that the trauma of enslaved men at the hands of white women was both real and systemic, and that the erasure of their voices was itself a tool of social control. These narratives, however fragmented, bear witness to resilience and illuminate the intricate intersections of power, race, and gender, reminding us that the truths of history are often buried beneath layers of silence, yet they remain essential to fully comprehending the human cost of slavery. The end of the Civil War in 1865 marked the formal abolition of slavery in the United States. Yet the transition from bondage to freedom was neither immediate nor absolute. And for many formerly enslaved people, the legacy of control and exploitation persisted in new forms. White women, whose power had long been exercised within the domestic and economic spheres of the plantation, adapted to the post-war landscape by leveraging coercive labor contracts, social influence, and cultural narratives to maintain dominance over those who had once been enslaved. Freedmen and women often found themselves bound to exploitative arrangements that mirrored the strictures of slavery, working under threat of legal or extralegal reprisal, while the rhetoric of benevolence and paternalism disguised the harsh realities of their continued subjugation. These contracts, which were enforced through local courts, intimidation, and sometimes outright violence, ensured that white women could preserve economic advantage and labor control, even as the legal framework of slavery was dismantled, illustrating the adaptability of power in response to societal change. Historical accounts reveal that some white women actively relocated formerly enslaved people to regions where union oversight was minimal, compelling them to labor under strict supervision and often under armed threat, effectively prolonging conditions of forced labor well beyond emancipation. Martha Gibbs, for example, reportedly moved her former slaves to Texas, compelling them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866, a year after slavery's formal abolition. These actions underscore the determination of some white women to maintain the economic and social hierarchies that had long defined their status, revealing the intersection of gender, race, and power in shaping post-war dynamics. The persistence of such coercive practices highlights the ways in which authority could be exercised without the explicit legal sanction of slavery, relying instead on intimidation. Social expectations and the residual structures of plantation society. Cultural portrayals of slavery further reinforced these dynamics. As literature, memoirs, and novels written by women or centered on women's perspectives often depicted the institution as gentle, benign, or even morally justifiable, glossing over the realities of coercion, exploitation, and abuse. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, for instance, although published decades after the Civil War, presents a romanticized vision of Southern life and the plantation system, framing female protagonists as benevolent figures whose actions conceal the underlying violence and systemic oppression endured by formerly enslaved people. Through such portrayals, white women not only shaped public perception but also reinforced their own social legitimacy, embedding narratives that justified hierarchical control and obscured the ongoing struggles of black laborers navigating the uncertain terrain of freedom. The combination of coercive labor arrangements and cultural narratives created a continuity of control that extended the influence of white women into the post-war era, highlighting their active engagement in shaping economic and social outcomes. By orchestrating labor contracts, relocating freedmen and women, and influencing cultural memory, these women maintained forms of authority that mirrored, if not replicated, the structures of slavery itself. For formerly enslaved people, this meant that emancipation was often partial, constrained by the lingering presence of those who had previously exercised control over every aspect of their lives. The persistence of such exploitation underscores the enduring entanglement of race, gender, and power in post-war America, illustrating how societal hierarchies can be preserved even when legal structures change. Understanding these post-Civil War practices provides crucial context for the long shadow cast by slavery, demonstrating that the transition to freedom was neither straightforward nor uniformly protective of the rights and autonomy of formerly enslaved people. It highlights the adaptability of power and the ways in which white women could leverage social, economic, and cultural mechanisms to maintain dominance, while revealing the resilience and resistance of those who sought to navigate and survive within this continuing web of coercion. By examining both the overt and subtle forms of post-war exploitation, we gain a more complete understanding of how systemic oppression endured beyond emancipation. Shaping communities, labor relations, and social hierarchies in ways that reverberated for generations. As we reflect on the history of slavery, it becomes clear that understanding the experiences of those who were enslaved requires looking beyond the most commonly told narratives and confronting the uncomfortable truths that have too often been overlooked. Recognizing the abuses inflicted by white women on black male slaves is essential to this fuller understanding, because it illuminates the intricate ways in which race, gender, and power intersected to create systems of control that were both pervasive and deeply personal. By examining these hidden histories, we see that slavery was not merely a matter of economic exploitation or male dominance, but a complex social structure in which power operated through intimate, psychological, and often violent means. Acknowledging these abuses allows us to honor the full spectrum of victims, giving voice to experiences that were historically suppressed or ignored, and ensures that the legacy of oppression is not sanitized or incomplete. The stories of black men who endured sexual coercion, forced labor, and systemic control at the hands of white women challenge traditional assumptions about vulnerability, agency, and culpability, showing that violence and domination were not confined by gender and that oppression could manifest in multifaceted ways. These histories reveal how societal norms, cultural narratives, and legal structures worked together to protect the image of white womanhood while marginalizing the suffering of those enslaved, creating a legacy of silence that persists in historical accounts. By confronting these silences, we reclaim the humanity and resilience of enslaved individuals, ensuring that their struggles and resistance are recognized and remembered. Understanding this aspect of slavery also emphasizes the enduring importance of intersectionality in historical analysis. Race, gender, and power were inseparably linked in shaping the experiences of both the oppressed and the oppressors. And only by acknowledging all dimensions of these dynamics can we fully grasp the social, cultural, and psychological realities of the era. It reminds us that the oppression of enslaved people was not monolithic, and that the actions of women, alongside men, played a significant role in maintaining hierarchical structures that affected every aspect of daily life on the plantation and beyond. By including these narratives, we challenge simplified or incomplete histories and work toward a more accurate, inclusive, and just understanding of the past. As we conclude this exploration, it is important to carry forward the lessons these histories teach us. The resilience of those who endured unimaginable hardship, the complexities of power and privilege, and the moral imperative to give voice to the silenced. By doing, we honor all victims of slavery, recognize the full scope of systemic abuse, and cultivate empathy and awareness that extend far beyond the pages of history. Thank you for joining us in this journey through a difficult but vital part of history. If you found this video insightful, please support our work by hitting the like button, sharing it with friends, and subscribing to our channel to stay connected with more stories that uncover hidden truths and elevate the voices of those who endured oppression. Your engagement helps ensure that these histories are remembered, respected, and learned from, so we can continue to shine light on the full human experience behind slavery.